So welcome to Top Historians Roundtable, Global History and Chinese History series and methodologies. Dialogues among historians of different generations. So this event is organized by Professor Zhang from Indiana University, Professor Taisu Zhang from Yale University, and myself. I'm teaching at SUNY Farmingdale, and also I'm the founder of the global scholarly platform Global Studies Forum. So this event is also organized by Global Studies Forum, hosted by Global Studies Forum and co-hosted by Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University. And we are very pleased to have all the distinguished scholars, including Professor Brook from the University of British Columbia, Professor Prasenjit Duara from Duke University, Professor Valerie Hansen from Yale University, Professor Kenneth Pomeranz from the University of Chicago, Professor HIlde from KU Leuven, and joined by Professor Zhang from Indiana University and Taisu Zhang from Yale University. So I'm the moderator today. We have 1 hour and 30 minutes to discuss 3 questions. And also we are happy to have 8 live stream platforms and channels to live stream our event, including the Bilibili official channel and YouTube channel of Global Studies Forum, and the Bilibili official channel of Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University, and also its WeChat live stream channels. We also have 3 top Chinese publishers to live stream our event at their WeChat live stream. WeChat live stream channels,微信视频号. So 三年书店, SDX Joint Publishing Company, and 三年书店, 三年书情, and 中华 Book Company, 中华书局1912, CITIC site, 中信大方, 跳岛 FM, Talking Literature, and also from 政治学评鉴, Political Science Review, Bilibili channel. So basically we have 20 minutes for each question. So each panelist have about 3 minutes to answer the question. And then we have 20 to 30 minutes to have discussions and responses to each other from the panelists. We might not be able to have Q&A. So sorry for the audience. And okay, so let us just start. So question 1. So one of the recent trends in the field of China studies is the global turn. And all the panelists here have all embraced this trend. So the question is, what encouraged you to undertake this transition? And what significance do you attribute to the global turn? So question 1. So let us just follow the sequence on the poster from Professor Brook.
Okay, I'm happy to begin. I would say there are 2 things that persuaded me to think on a global scale. And to explain this, I've got to go back to the 1980s, which is when this trend got going. One was I found myself teaching in a history department at the University of Toronto in Canada, and most of my students were not at all interested in China. That is at the graduate level, so that if I wanted to teach graduate students, I had to situate China in a global context. And I ended up teaching a course on theories of world history. It was a way for me to smuggle China into their curricula, if you like. But it was also a way, it created the opportunity for them to realize that they can think about it. You can specialize in Uzbekistan, but you can think about the world. And in the same way you can specialize in China, but you need to think on a broader scale. So it was kind of a theoretical push on my part to be able to speak to the graduate students in the program. But I would say the other component of this is my own thinking. That is, I study something because it matters to me. And it doesn't matter to me because it's Chinese or Canadian or whatever. It matters to me because it's something that I wanted to think about. And so I've always encouraged my students to find the context that will allow them to think about whatever it is that they're researching. So in my case, researching China, I realized that I needed to find a larger context for it. And that's why I joined the global turn.
Thank you very much. So maybe Professor Hansen, your turn first.
Okay, thank you so much. I actually think that I mean, it is true that the field began to take a global turn in the 1980s, but it wasn't new in the 1980s. If you and I'll be talking in my various moments about Naito Torajiro, but he was from the get-go. Anyone interested in Tangsung history was considering it in a world framework, and he was thinking very much about the comparisons with Europe and with Japan. My own advisor was Robert Hartwell, and he studied at the University of Chicago in the Committee of Social Thought with a European historian named John Neff. And so when Hartwell was writing about iron and steel in China, he was thinking very much about iron and steel in Europe. So it's new in a way, but it's also old. The global turn is new in a way, but it's also old in a way. In terms of my own trajectory, I think almost everybody here was, when you write your dissertation, you are probably at the most focused you'll be at any moment in your life. I see. So I was going to say, sorry, but in terms of my own thinking, I think, like most people, when I was writing my dissertation, I was thinking mostly about China. But the second I got tenure, I gained the freedom to think more broadly. I was at that point working on the Silk Road and on Turfan, and realized that there were questions that interested me that the sources that answered those questions were not in English. And that was, for me, a real turning point. And also at the same time, I got involved in a world history textbook. And I think a lot of us on the panel have had that experience too. And so I read a lot in world history. So I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, in my case, I came with a graduate degree from India, and I was always interested in a comparative study of China and India, and I was so that was the comparative angle. Also led me to wonder as to why history was always done through a national lens, through a national optic. And then, when there was a big interest in with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Cold War, at least in the West, there was a lot of interest in transnationalism and globalism and so on. I took that opportunity. Luckily, as Valerie said, I had tenure by then. I was at the University of Chicago, and so I decided to move in very much into this transnational history, what began as transnational, and I became very quickly convinced that nations looked very much like each other, and they were doing things that were very much like each other, although, of course, there were significant differences. There was a dual kind of movement. One was something that was happening institutionally, which was somewhat channeled and tunneled, and the other that was always receiving and sending out communication and information and cultures and economies out and in, if you know what I mean. So it was a kind of a warp and woof situation. So that's how I got interested in global studies. So I want to say that that certainly the early 90s encouraged me to move in that direction. That's it.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Duara. So our next speaker is Professor Kenneth Pomeranz.
Thank you. So my answer in some ways resembles those of these people who have already spoken, but in a different combination. I actually started out in European history before I got interested in China. And in fact, when I had to make a choice in graduate school what to do, part of my thinking was, well, I have English, I have French and German, I've got a basic background in European history. If I want to do comparative or global work, I can always go back. If I don't learn Chinese and Japanese now, I'm not going to learn them after I get tenure. So part of my choice was always a tactical one in that sense. And it came from the fact that I was interested always in comparison. And then as time went on, came to see that part of what comparison revealed was that the units you were comparing shouldn't be taken for granted. Above all, that the nation shouldn't be taken for granted as the end point of historical evolution, and that required thinking in very different spatial terms. So some global history is very, very large. Some of it actually goes well below the spatial level of the nation state to look at how a given place that may now be part of China or the United States or Brazil or whatever was at one time much more strongly connected to other places. I also had an experience when I began teaching that's somewhat like what Tim Brook described. So I started at UC Irvine, and at the time it was a small graduate program, overwhelmingly, in fact, almost exclusively in American and Western European history. And I knew it was going to be a while before we could build a China program. At the same time, I had an undergraduate curriculum where, because of the large number of ethnically Chinese students in Southern California, I had a lot of undergrads who were eager to take a China course, but who thought that they already knew exactly what China was. China was what they had learned at home. And in fact, they were taking the China course often because they figured that was the easiest way to fulfill their humanities distribution requirements. And I saw part of my duty is to kind of shake them up and say, no, there are a lot of different ways of looking at China, some of which are only require you to step outside of it and look back. And so the combination of, as Tim said, wanting to speak to graduate students who weren't working on China, which required going to the global level, and then also wanting to use my undergraduate teaching to shake up some of the taken for granted ideas about the modern nation as an inevitable fulfillment of historical trajectories, made me want to break away. And like everybody else, as soon as I got tenure, that's what I did. I guess I'd throw in one more thing just because it's the sort of thing that we often don't talk about in public, but I think matters. So about the time that I got tenure, I also had little children. And I had a choice between a second book project that would have required going every summer to China, and particularly given that project to rural North China, and a project that could do much more with libraries. And that was a lot more consistent with the stage of life I was in. And so I decided to do that one first and never looked back.
Okay, thank you, Professor Pomeranz. So Professor Zhang, your turn.
Thank you so much. And I'm very honored to be with this group of distinguished scholars, each of whom I admire so much. I want to say that when I finished my first book, I was trained as a social historian, and I worked on local history. And when I finished my first book, I got tenure, and tenure is important. And I began to think about what I should do that is more meaningful. And I started reading the books that had little to do with China. And after all these readings, I began to realize that there were so many things out there that we didn't know. And if we only focus on China, that we will never have the opportunity to know. And then Professor Pomeranz and the Duara, their works as a whole has been a great influence on me. And I began to realize that we can understand Chinese history with a much broader view of the history as a whole. And then, as I was continuing to read and collect materials for the new book, and Valerie Hansen's book came out, A Silk Road, and that was a sort of not just a confirmation of what the direction that the field is going, but also it's an encouragement to me that we can look at history in that way. So over the years that I have started to do started to pursue the global perspective of Chinese history and the interconnectedness between the global and the local, and I have never ever regretted doing that.
Oh, great. So most people talk about tenure. So I translate it in Chinese as 天牛，就是天上的牛这样。Okay. So and also Taisu and I also have little children too. So we are at different stages. So Taisu, your turn.
So in my personal experience, to some extent, like I'm a relatively question-driven person. So I have a set of questions first, and then I, at some point, begin to figure out like why exactly, how exactly deal with them. And it just seemed to me right from the beginning, when I was beginning to contemplate serious academic research and graduate studies, that the questions that really interested me in either modern Chinese history or Chinese law or Chinese politics were all somewhat comparative in scope. There are, two ways to define global history. I guess you can define global history in kind of like a transnational, transregional way, and then you can define it in a comparative way. The two are closely connected, but not quite the same thing. One emphasizes connections, transmissions. In some ways, if you're doing transnational history, the goal is almost to kind of deconstruct traditional categories and boundaries and so on and so forth. Whereas if you're doing comparisons, you can deconstruct traditional categories, but before you can actually begin to compare and contrast, you have to build new categories and new concepts and new borders of your own. Because, as Ken said, you have to compare two units and you have to define the units somehow. So possibly there was something about that kind of boundary drawing exercise, which naturally required a great amount of, in some ways, like theoretical thinking and conceptual thinking that appealed to me. But at the same time, it also seems like modern Chinese politics, from the internal point of view, has been constantly driven by various kinds of comparative tensions, right? So Chinese elites are always consciously measuring themselves against the outside, perceptions of falling behind the outside world, perceptions of being invaded or semi-colonialized, or just in some ways like being geopolitically oppressed by the outside. Those kinds of perceptions drive Chinese political discourse, elite psyche, intellectual discourse to an enormous extent. And I guess growing up in that world, I was no different from any of this. Like I was naturally enthralled by questions of, why did China fall behind? How is it beginning to catch up? How can it actually catch back up? What's actually the difference between us and other systems that makes our geopolitics frame in a certain kind of way? So given that those were the questions, right, naturally then to pursue a certain kind of comparative method was not just necessary, it was completely essential. And so beyond that, once I began to get into this kind of thing, it turned out that this kind of comparative history, again, given the category constructing, boundary drawing exercises that it necessarily demands, fits relatively well with my theoretical interests and conceptual interests. It fits relatively well with the mindset of a legal scholar in some ways. And so that's how I got into this entire thing.
So I'd like to start out with maybe a qualification there too. I think I didn't start out to join a global turn in isolation. I think for me, the global turn, and certainly now that I engage with it explicitly in research, responds to earlier turns, and in part also feeds onto turns that are happening around the same time. So for example, for me, the global turn, when I study the history of infrastructures, intersects with the material turn, with the environmental turn, the digital turn, and also the infrastructural turn. And it also, I think, has taken a shape in response to the social economic history of the 60s and 70s, the anthropological turn, linguistic turn, the cultural turn of the 80s and 90s. So in other words, I think it is something that takes place within a larger ecology in history. And my own engagement, I think, follows a very similar trajectory, even though perhaps it was 20 years later than what Tim Brook and also Ken Pomeranz were describing. When I started teaching in the early 2000s, I started teaching in a history department, even though my background was very much first in Chinese studies and later in Chinese history. And I was, I had to work hard those first years, but I was very pleased to join a history department. This was at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville, that gave me the opportunities and also invited me to teach and to think about history as the history of human communities and environments in a very broad sense. That is without modern territorial or geopolitical boundaries, and to some extent also even without or with flexible temporal guidelines. I could move across the entire span of history. And so that the larger point here is that academic environment can really matter. And so some of the contingencies, I think, that were described earlier come into play there as well. But over time, I've become as a result of this, a fervent supporter of embedding Chinese or East Asian history in history departments and not exclusively in area studies, because oftentimes that is really nation studies, and that does take on a particular shape of historiography. And so I've split my time. When I look back, about half of it in history departments, about half of it in area studies departments. And when I look at my teaching, half or more of my teaching in history departments was in global or what we then called world history, in terms of survey, but also Eurasian history. I taught a course on the history of socialization in the medieval world, broadly conceived, and also historiography or theory courses that allowed me to bring in work from various areas. And at the time, we also built a bit of a community around that, because all of us felt somewhat inadequate. I think we have that experience that when you first enter an entirely different historiography, it can be helpful to talk with colleagues about sources, about ideas, about questions and themes. To some extent, that fit my high school training very well too. I later realized, I think we used, in French, we read people like Montaigne, Rousseau, or Voltaire, and in some ways I take Valerie's point too, that they treated human history as a laboratory. They compared not only to write history, but also to think about or to develop theories of various aspects of human development and history. So a last quick point that I'll make in regard to this is that it started perhaps with that, but I until relatively recently, never explicitly in my own writing, in my own research, talked about global history. So the last thing I'll quickly say is that my own very explicit engagement in research in global history came around 2016-17. And in an unexpected field, I would say, that I was translating a Zhang The Essentials of Governance for the text in the history of political thought. And when doing the proposal and writing the introduction, I realized that I could only properly contextualize the writing about governance historically if I moved beyond a traditional sort of Chinese Confucianism kind of context and really looked at medieval court worlds, the early modern uses of these texts. And in some ways, it made me rethink also what I was looking at. It made me rethink this as an administrative technology. And in that way, I think we can contribute not only to Chinese and East Asian history, but also position that within broader histories on specific themes, as in this case about governance. So I will leave it at that.
Thank you so much, Professor Hilde de Weedt. I apologize again. And so let us move on to the question 2 So we talk about in terms of global studies, what opportunities and challenges do you see in global studies, and what advantages and disadvantages of global studies? Let us also start with Professor Timothy Brook.
The great opportunity of global history is that we get away from nationalist narratives. History, through historical time, history has always been written such that it celebrates the heroism of some leader or some entity or some state. And we're still stuck with that. Americans still think the United States is a great country. I assume Russians think Russia is a great country. Chinese thinks China is a great country. But as historians, our goal is not to do that. It's to see what happened and then apply analysis to it. And you can't have heroes and villains when you're applying analysis. So I think by moving the lens out away from one country to a broader framework, it enables us to be more analytical in the way in which we look at the history of any one country. Now, I think the challenge is that you don't want to lose track of the local, because no matter how global anything might appear from that perspective, it only works out down on the ground where people are living their lives and doing whatever it is they're doing. So just because you're starving because of a massive climate downturn, that the climate downturn doesn't explain your life. Your life is what you work out in relationship to the environment around you. So one of the problems of global history is that I think there's a tendency to kind of eradicate the local, and yet the local, I mean, history only happens at the local level. It doesn't happen at the global level. It happens at the global level if you're talking about something like climate history. But the way in which events fall out happens down at the local level. So it's a bit of a fine balance that you have to, as a historian who's taking a global perspective, a fine balance you have to strike between the global influences that are shaping what's going on, and then the way in which localities don't just manifest the influence of global influences, but also work out responses to them. So that would be my answer to the second question.
Thank you very much. Professor Duara, your turn.
Yeah, the opportunities, I think Tim has laid it out very well. Nations are, as I've said before, are themselves constructed from global forms. So they do have to mythologize a lot of their originality and their evolution or their origins of different things. And of course, we know that it's much easier to deconstruct, to break that down, than to see how other forces have actually contributed to it. And we really need to do much more of that than the deconstruction. The tricky issue, as Tim and I'm sure all the others will point out, is how one sort of does the relationship between the local and the global. And it seems to me, and I'm not very clear on this, but I think there are three different approaches that I have noticed. The one is, the first one I call scaling, right? Going from a lower scale to a higher, or a higher scale to a lower. And as a movement or a product travels up and down, you know, what Skinner might call in the Skinnerian mode, although applied perhaps globally to different hierarchies of places. This is, there are changes and there are transformations. And so we look for joints and nodes which are critical in these transformations. And actually, you can also see how certain changes at top, at the higher levels, make differences at the lower level. I'm thinking actually of Ken Pomeranz's first book on the Huaibei region, where you know, the kinds of investments that used to go into that region stopped going because of other statist needs or anti-imperialist needs. And so these areas changed, but they changed, but they also took on a different role. So much of the periphery, for instance, became, I don't think in Huaibei, but in the southwest and so on of China, became opium growing areas and things like that, right? So you do have changes that are affected by different levels in the hierarchy. The second approach is to really keep the place constant and see how different local forces and spaces interact at that local level. And I think Changxin's work does that in his new Global and the Local, and looks at the sort of ways in which the two really reshape each other. So I think that's a kind of a second way. And the third way is the kind that I use mostly, which I call circulatory histories, where I follow the processes and travels of materials and ideas. One advantage of the circulatory history is that you don't have to understand it in an originary way. We are not looking for where something originated, because every time a process, a good or something moves to another place, it is different, right? It is recreated, it is repurposed, and so on. I always give the example of Marxism in China. How by the time Marxism comes in, you know, when Marx is talking about is talking about the revolution in Europe, he thinks of the proletariat as the only class that can do it, and he saw the peasants as a sack of potatoes. And he was really influenced by the French idea of, you know, little holdings and so on. But by the time, well, it goes through another round of transformations in Russia. And then by the time it comes to China, you have this, you know, Mao Zedong has also already written the Hunan Peasant Report, and he's ready to have the peasants undertake a massive revolution. So then, you know, it's transformed in each place, but yet we can see certain continuity. And beyond that also we can see, you know, now if you look at where Maoism has gone, you see that it's gone to mainly tribal places, because in most non-tribal places, you have the agrarian structure pretty well laid out. So they have certain autonomy. The tribal groups have autonomy. So, you know, you see them among Chiapas, you see them among Naxalites in India and Nepal and so on. So it's interesting, I think, to follow the circulatory forms here. And of course, there are, obstacles and impositions and so on that you also have to count for. But I think I'll leave it at that, in the kind of a threefold understanding that I have of the relation of the challenge between the global and the local.
So Professor Hansen, your turn.
I want to start by saying something that no one has said yet, which is that I'm always struck by the generosity of people in China, that they're interested in what outsiders have to say about their history. And that even this panel illustrates that there's I just think a great warmth extended to historians who working outside of China, who I would say clearly don't have the linguistic capacity of native speakers. And I understand that there are native speakers who live outside of China, and all of these things are blurry. But to me, the real advantage of global history is that as outsiders, we can say something about any development in China in a larger frame, and that historians who are working inside China, much like American historians working inside the United States, have such a deep and rich historiography to contend with that it's almost impossible for them to rise above their subject matter and put America in a global context. And the opportunity for those of us working in Chinese history to sketch a broader world that China is a part of, I think is really a fabulous opportunity. I think the challenge is, and Tim and Prasenjit have already talked about losing sight of the local. I think there's a linguistic component here too, that I mean, all of us read Chinese, so we know what happens when people who don't read Chinese write about China. And when we write about other parts of the world, we're dependent on an English language, mostly English language historiography. And, that works better for some places than others. And so I think one of the great virtues of being trained in any historical tradition is you have a sense of how to write about the local. And then the challenge, anytime you scale up, as Prasenjit said, that is to be able to write with the same sensitivity about places where you cannot read primary sources in the original. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Hansen. So Professor Kenneth Pomeranz.
Thank you. I think the speakers who've gone before me have already laid out the basic challenges and opportunities very nicely. Yes, the global frame allows us to think different thoughts and challenge common sense in a way that is very hard to do within any national tradition. And that's a task that is by no means finished. So that remains the great opportunity. And the challenges are, yes, you can lose sight of the local. It's not inevitable. I think we can all think of ways in works that manage to sort of navigate those multiple scales about a particular place and do it well, but it's difficult. And there's also, of course, the problem of, as we look for places or individuals or kinds of discourses that enable us to bridge those multiple levels, because we can see them operating different scales, are we skewing the sample of things that make up history? Are we privileging the mobile, for instance, over the stationary, right? Because, I mean, there are wonderful, wonderful stories, for instance, about people who move, but we all know that most of the time in most of the world, most of the population has not moved very far. That doesn't make them any less a part of global history. And I think that's something we can lose, that we need to think about. I also think, and this varies a good deal depending on what kind of institution you're based in and what country you're based in. But we've talked a lot about the problem of the nation. We haven't talked as much about the problem of area studies. Area studies being both a tremendous resource, right? This tends to be where language training resources will be concentrated, for instance. This tends to be, particularly in the West, but elsewhere too, where governments have tended to be willing to put money to promote the study of places beyond their own national borders. And of course, area studies have the advantage over nation states that there's less stake in them, right? No government is particularly concerned that you glorify a particular area or treat it as inevitable, because we all realize their constructions. But at the same time, area studies can be profoundly limiting, right? Because they do suggest that, if you're working on China but looking beyond China, you should be looking to China and Korea, Japan and Korea, and not to various other places that may actually be as good or better for placing China in a larger perspective. And they tend to assume that we know what the units that make up the area are, right? So if East Asia is China, Japan, and Korea, then we're right back to assuming that we know that China, Japan, and Korea are meaningful containers. It's not about China, but I can't help recommending, just because I just finished reading it, a book by one of my colleagues, Mauricio Tenorio, called Latin America, The Allure and Power of an Idea, which is, on the one hand, a devastating critique of how distorting the idea of Latin America has been and how much damage it's done to our understanding of a wide range of places from the Rio Grande south to Patagonia, but at the same time is a book that's not naive in saying, oh, we could just get rid of this. His last chapter is called something like Latin America is here to stay. And so the question is, what do we then do with these categories? Not only in an institutional sense, where we don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater because the baby provides crucial resources for studying things beyond the endlessly parochial concerns of Americans, but their countries have their own similar problems. But also that you can't just, all these areas, and here I very much include East Asia, embody a certain set of taken for granted assumptions about what unites that region. So for East Asia, it's something like rice, tofu, Confucianism, and Buddhism, which we all know do not in fact characterize all of the region. But our job is to not to pretend that those categories and assumptions aren't there, but to accept that they're there and argue with them. And I think global history is very, very useful in doing that, at the same time that it's never going to entirely free itself from that.
So thank you so much. It's very poetic. And also all the speakers talk about the perspective of the outsider. So it reminds me of an article of Professor Brook, and because he mentions about 11 turns in his career. And then he's also talking about his perspective as the outsider. But Chinese historians like Zhao Guang, he also mentions that it's not natural that the Chinese historians would have insider perspectives. And also Professor Hansen also talks about the outsider perspective. And all the speakers talk about the global frame and also the interaction between the local and the global. And I think Professor Pomeranz talks about very in a poetic way that the global study could free itself, and also it's dealing with the existing categories. So we can question the notions of nation and also area studies. So it's Professor HIlde de Weedt, it's your turn.
All right.
Yeah.
Opportunities and challenges, and perhaps also pros and cons gained in my own work. I would say the main thing that I gain is a different perspective, a global perspective, a sense of the fluidity of different types of boundaries, spatial boundaries, but also temporal boundaries, and sometimes also object-related boundaries, that objects are composed of ingredients, designs that come from different places, and analyzing those gives us a sense of the fluidity also of those sorts of entities that we think have fixed boundaries. So I'm going to explain some of those examples, but I wanted to also sort of in a more general term go over perhaps one point that hasn't been mentioned. I also had on my list the methodological nationalism of area studies and other kinds of centrisms, Euro, sometimes also Sino, and certainly also modern-centric approaches that I think all perhaps are a challenge, but also an opportunity for us to enrich our questions and ways of analysis. But those have been talked about. Perhaps the one challenge that I've had in collaborative projects, sometimes also in teaching that may not have been mentioned yet, is the challenge to overcome preconceived notions of difference. And these are oftentimes surface, very large concepts. Christianity versus Confucianism is a good example. And what I invite students typically to do, and what we did in a comparative study of communication in Europe and in European and Chinese history, was to think instead of structural equivalences. That is to say, either people, concepts, or routines. What roles do they, or in what ways do they shape societies? And to look there not only for similarities, of course, for differences, for different ways of dealing with challenges and crises, but to not start with surface comparisons of huge ideas, such as the attributes that we might associate with Christianity, the attributes that we might associate with oftentimes East Asian Confucianism. And that can be a real challenge. It struck me, for example, also very recently, we had a postdoc do to my idea at least, a wonderful presentation on how communities in Latin America tried to turn some of their local heroes into saints, and had to lobby very hard, investing tons of funding through Spain to persuade the Vatican to do this, oftentimes for years, employing middlemen of various kinds. And yeah, those coming from an East Asian perspective, oh, this is typically European, right? This is so different. And then you think about, well, obviously not. If you think about the history of shrines, local shrines, and the negotiations that involved with authorities at different levels, you there have a very interesting case of how you look at how societies have to deal with various authorities to commemorate those that are dear to them, oftentimes from a very local perspective, but moving them up through the range. So this is just one example. Now, in my own work, I've also come to I see the local global less of an issue, perhaps because I've started with things that were actually relatively small, say one text, for example, or a set of text. And so for me, doing global history there doesn't mean doing the history of everything, or doing the history of the world, or even the history of a particular part of it. For me, the global history of political advice literature, for example, is looking at the entanglements of administrative technologies in medieval courts. How did these things circulate? And when we look through their adaptations over time, what sorts of adaptations do we see, in this case, in Prussian courts, in Russian courts, and also in Japanese courts? And we can take that through time, because oftentimes we associate vernacularization and also the flows within East Asia, with early modern to modern times, and there we see that actually that too doesn't apply. So I think there's also value in doing transtemporal global studies of very specific items, because they give us a very different perspective on texts that we tend to take for granted. And the last thing I wanted to say about perhaps one of the problems that was noted, and perhaps something that has given global history a bad rap, that's two things: perhaps the assumption that it is comprehensive scale, whereas I think Ken Pomeranz in one of his AHA presidential talks showed very beautifully that it's about scaling, it's about it moving up and down various levels. But also that it tends to be about the flow of goods, ideas, persons, that it's about circulation. And for the work that I'm currently doing, which is really about the social history of infrastructures, I think it becomes very clear that if you look at the global history that has been done on that part, there's a clear sensitivity to the polarities of laying out large-scale infrastructure. That is to say, that it's about integration, but it's also about the opposite. It's about segregation. It's about connectivity, but it's equally about exclusion. It's about class. It's about building community and identity through roads and walls, but it's also about conflicts and adaptations of those, and staring those down sometimes. It's about visions and ideas, the things that we attribute to those in various places. Actually, our own ideas about infrastructure are based on reports that were done by Jesuits in East Indian Company about Chinese infrastructures, and the idea that they're durable and those sorts of things. But when we actually look at histories and various types of historical sources, we see that their actual uses and effects can be very, very different. And I think global history can very easily encompass that variety of perspective and make us also sensitive to the point that this happens in various places, perhaps at various moments, but equally that we don't fall back into the trap that I noted to earlier, that is to start with bipolar oppositions that then are the framework for further deductions. So that would be my response to those two questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I think it's also very poetic because I feel the global history is very poetic because as Professor Pomeranz talks about, it could free itself, and also Professor HIlde de Weedt is talking about it's about the flow. The global history is about the flow of ideas and the goods, and also she's talking about the differences, and we question the differences, and also huge ideas. So global history is always about transcending boundaries, and she's talking about infrastructures, and she's doing her research, current research. And thank you so much. I feel it's like we are going to really doing global history in a very poetic way, because personally I'm from the background of literature. So so next speaker, Professor Zhang.
I think the panelists in here who have spoke before me had said very well, and I'm so glad that that people have recognized that the challenge, part of the challenges, is that we need to pay attention to the local level of studies, and which is something that I'm very interested in. Let me say that first of all, the significance of global study or expansion to the global perspective is quite obvious, but I would like to focus on what I consider to be the challenges. I think there are three kinds of challenges that we're facing, that depending on the perspectives and the approach to the history that we are dealing with. The first one is that the expansion, what I would call the scope, the expansion, the spatial scope that extended to the rest of the globe. And that challenge is that it requires a whole lot of knowledge about the rest of the world, which is, for a person who is just focusing on a particular locale or particular nation state, history of a nation within the particular state, that is something that is quite challenging, I think. And Valerie Hansen is a great example of doing that quite successfully, and Kenneth and President Duara he's working on the circulatory history is the example of that. And the second challenge that we're facing is the understanding of what we call the long durée, and the evolvement through periods of time. And this is something I think that many of the people who are have been focusing on. The third realm of the research that we are facing challenge is exactly what I will call the global and local interaction. So fortunately, the panelists sitting in here, everyone sitting here is deeply rooted in local studies. And if you check their publication, they all started with very solid research on the local level of societies. That gave them the opportunity. That gave them the opportunity and the skills to base their research on the solid evidences and the things, for example, Timothy Brook, based on the local gazetteer and climate change, and based on a price of the rice and the decline of the price of rice, and how, even though his work is dealing with the little ice age and the climate change in global change, but his work is still very much deeply rooted in the local level of archives, the local level of documents, and Valerie Hansen's also. I think that it is a different kind of a challenge if you want to pursue the study in that way. And we will reap the different kinds of benefits to some extent. As a whole, this will contribute to our understanding of of Chinese society so much more so than we could have done without extending those what we call the scopes. And so I think that we are on the right track because we are all facing different challenges in different ways, and each of us is pursuing a different aspect of that challenge. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Zhang. So last year, actually, we also had 3 conferences with Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University, and I talk about global history and the shaping of the world. So as speakers mentioned here, so global history is about the flow, and also the shaping. So it's always crossing the centuries. So as Professor Zhang talks about, we are doing global history. So at the temporal level, so we are doing, like, all the panelists here are doing long duration research, and also at the spatial level, we are doing global history. And also Professor HIlde de Weedt was also talking about the modern centric, the question of the modern centric. So we can see that all the panelists here are also crossing the so-called modern, pre-modern boundaries. So all the panelists here are doing pre-modern and modern studies. So yeah, so I'm excited to hear all the brilliant comments and points here. So Taisu, your turn.
For me, I think the benefits of comparative history are kind of largely self-explanatory. I don't think you can actually understand a gigantic chunk of what just goes on in China since at least the 1840s. Or frankly, much earlier than that, if you don't have some kind of global view and some kind of comparative view, because of the simple reason that the actors that you're studying, especially if you focus more on the state, and perhaps more on elites, like I tend to do, they were themselves globalists and comparativists in political orientation. So in some ways, like their worldview dictates a pretty large chunk of your worldview. And if you want to take them seriously, you have to be able to see things in the way that they see things, and then begin to independently assess whether the ways that they saw things had any kind of basis in truth, or were they political constructions or ideological constructions. That said, I mean, the challenges, of course, are always not to be overly misled by that. You always have to kind of keep a critical eye on this kind of thing, and to make sure that you're balancing narrative with empirical truth in a proper and responsible way. To not do so, just there's this like nice nice passage in this book that I was reading about the English informational state. To not do so would be to let your narrative and theoretical carriage go before the empirical horse. But even assuming all that, right, there are some kind of unique challenges of doing comparative history in a more externalist, objective way, which is, in some ways, it forces you to be a theorist. And the reason for this is largely that you can think of transnational history in multiple ways. You don't necessarily have to be overly theoretical when doing transnational history, but comparative history is an inherently theoretical exercise, in the sense that the very act of comparison is an act in abstraction and, to some extent, simplification. Right? You can't. It's impossible to compare history in all its complexity. You can only do so in some ways by flattening otherwise incredibly infinitely complex phenomenon and entities onto a measurable, comparable dimension where things are inevitably somewhat flattened. So to do that requires you to have at least the ability to explain your own theoretical priors, because everyone has theoretical priors when they come into this kind of analysis. To not acknowledge that, I think, would be largely self-illusionary. And the skill, I think, is in a certain amount of self-reflection to actually excavate your own priors and to show them to others so that you can actually effectively communicate and also have your priors potentially be falsified by the empirical research of other people. Besides that, right, to some extent, the greatest value of comparison is comparison helps us understand causation. I understand that this is not something that many historians want to acknowledge that they're actually in the business of doing, like analyzing causation and giving causal accounts. But to me, no historical narrative is actually possible without at least some account of causality, or at least kind of like a rough, non-structured view of causality. You have to have something of that sort. And one of the best ways to get at broader patterns of causality at the macro level is, of course, through comparison, because that gives you a certain kind of logical structure to figure out, at the very least, what were possibly necessary conditions and causes for various kinds of phenomena. It may not necessarily give you any reliable insight on what are sufficient conditions for various kinds of phenomena to emerge, but at the very least, the act of comparison, the act of contrasting, is an act of kind of a causal simplification and controlling that allows you to identify various kinds of necessary conditions. So those are the ways that I think of the kinds of comparative exercises that I like to do the most. It probably should be relatively obvious from this that in a lot of ways, in terms of perspective, in terms of method, I may have more in common with social scientists than I have with the bulk of historians, and certainly with the vast majority of area studies people. But I'm always happy to interact with them and be corrected by them when I empirically overstep and so on and so forth. So usually it's a happy coexistence, I think.
Okay, thank you. So Taisu emphasized the perspective of comparative and transnational, and also we always go back to the great topic of the great divergence and the dialogue between East and West, and also the importance to have interactions and dialogues with the social sciences. So that's very good. So let us move on to the next question. Actually, we basically have 20 minutes. Yeah, next question. Furthermore, so what possible directions do you envision for the future of global studies? And could each of you elaborate on your current research project? And also, could you expand upon the theories you are going to use for your research and the methodologies you are using or you plan to use? And any reflections on the limits of previous or current theoretical frameworks? And what new theories or theoretical frameworks do you wish to use or create? So also we start with Professor Timothy Brook. Although you mentioned that you don't like theories.
No, theory is very important. We all work through theory. It depends how we filter it. Some of us put it out front. A lot of us just keep it in the back, which is what I tend to do. I don't write theory, but I have a few theoretical thoughts to give. I'm currently working on the most difficult project I've ever undertaken. I'm analyzing the creation of a library in 17th century England, and it's a library into which materials from all over the world were gathered. This is the library of John Selden. Some of you will know that 10 years ago, I published a book called Mr. Selden's Map of China, about a map of China that John Selden, who is a constitutional lawyer of the 1630s, 40s, and 50s, it's a map that he acquired. So I wrote a book about the map, but I haven't been able to set John Selden aside, because what intrigued me about him is that he was acquiring materials from Mexico, from Japan, from the Middle East, from a large number of places. And the question that I've posed for myself is, how do you integrate, or how did people in the 17th century integrate their knowledge of the world? How did they begin to develop the idea of the world as one place with many different regional resources for understanding how the world came about, how societies were formed, how states were created, where law comes from? These are the kinds of questions that intrigued John Selden. So I've gone way over to the other side now. I'm a complete outsider in English bibliography and English history, but I'm writing from that perspective, looking back at Asia and thinking about how Asia is being incorporated into the knowledge systems of Europeans in the 17th century. And for me, the theoretical problem is this question of knowledge. What is knowledge? What does it consist of? How do you integrate knowledge from many different locations? Why is that knowledge integration necessary. And for somebody like John Silden, it was necessary because he was trying to understand, where does law come from? And he didn't think God was the source of law. Humans are the source of law, and laws are different from one place to another. So where does law come from? This is one of his puzzles, and one of the reasons why he's collecting material from all over the world, and in fact, mastering half a dozen languages in order to read this material. So that's what I'm doing, and it's a global history of a very different sort. It's highly particular. I'm working with the titles of 8,000 books that I've reconstructed on the basis of an inventory that was drawn up after he died of his library. And I'm way in the deep end here, and it's stimulating to find myself up against problems on a scale that I've never had to deal with before.
Thank you so much. It's very important to think about knowledge. I think global history is also about people's knowledge about go, and also it's actually about global 17th century, as you have done in the past. And also you mentioned that you are the outsider of the 17th century England, but we are all the outsiders of the past as modern people, right? Yeah. So thank you very much, and I hope speakers could talk more about knowledge. It's very interesting. So next speaker, Professor Hansen.
I'm working on a project now. Well, I have two projects I've been thinking a lot about, and both of them are related to the question of the early modern and how European historians have defined the early modern versus how Chinese historians have defined the early modern. And one of the big differences, I think, speaking broadly, is that going back to Naito, that most of the definitions we have of the early modern in China look at internal factors inside China. So the Chinese economy, but not the Chinese economy as an export power, the Chinese economy in terms of domestic demand, printing, and the impact of printing, the development of the civil service exams and the meritocracy. And many of the definitions from European history, but not all of them, but many of them have a more external focus. The one that I keep going back to is Jerry Bentley's definition of the early modern as a period, and he's thinking very much about 1500, but a period when there are seaways, global seaways connecting different places in the world, that there's an exchange of species along those global pathways, and we can see early capitalism. And I think all of those things are happening in China, or not on a global scale, but on a hemispheric scale. So if we could recast those definitions so that it was half a globe, and the half a globe would stretch all the way from East Africa in the West all the way to the Philippines in the East, with China, of course, playing a key role in exchanges at that time. And when I say that time, I'm sorry, I should have said starting around 800 or 1000, that we can see the development of oceanic trade, of maritime trade, on a scale that nothing comparable is happening like that in Europe. So that's the kind of, and then I was going to say, so I've been reading a lot of European historians who are writing about the defining characteristics of the early modern, and thinking about some of the characteristics that they define, I think, are overly specific to Europe, like specifically for printing, to say you have to have movable type. I think that's the easiest example, where you could say, well, gee, the Chinese have movable type, but woodblock printing is much more important than movable type until the 19th century. But the Chinese are living in a world of print, just as people after Gutenberg are living in a world of print. So that's what I've been doing recently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So Professor Hansen is also like traveling time. So from medieval China until year 1000, and then she's writing a history of Asian age of exploration between 800 to 1500. So actually, all the panelists here are thinking about early modern and the transition from medieval to early modern or modern, and also we are thinking about early capitalism. So very excited about all the questions and also topics. And yeah, so next speaker, we have basically 12 minutes, sorry. Next speaker, Professor Kenneth Pomeranz.
Okay, I have a bunch of projects going, but I guess there are three that are worth mentioning in this connection. One is, of all things, a world history textbook. It's global in a very obvious way, but I also want to emphasize, and this links back to something that Taisu said a while ago, I think one of the things that writing that textbook has forced me to do, which was a bit of a surprise, is to be more explicit about theory. That when you write on such a large scale, it seems to me the issues of selectivity are so obvious. And if you don't want to do a book that's just a kind of compilation of greatest hits from around the world, you have to ask sort of, why am I choosing this and not that? Why are some of the things I choose to emphasize about region X not the ones that are most prominent in region X's national history narratives? And I think what we're trying to do in our book is let the student in on that. Let them see history as a discipline, remind them, hey, we've made a choice here to do this, that, or the other thing. And here are what we think the stakes are, to not just assume there are students come to us as tabula rasa, but assume that they come to us with a bunch of things they quote know, some true and some not true. And that our challenge is, again, to shake them out of some of that. And that we have to shake them out of that partly by acknowledging, in a way that textbooks almost never do, that we're arguing with other people, that we have disagreements, that there's no consensus on what's the most important. And that a book for beginning students should be, well, it should be a bit like the Pompidou Center in Paris. You should see the pipes, you should see the stuff that's usually hidden. So that's one project. The second is a book that I've been working on for a number of years. It is called simply, Why is China So Big? And that I think addresses in a pretty obvious way the question of the nation state, but also attempts to start very, very far back in time to ask a lot of different questions about why we get this particular political unit, why some others that at certain points looked like they would gel, don't gel, why when a unified China falls apart, it comes back together again. And the book is very theoretically eclectic, but it is dedicated to the notion that at any given moment, you can only make sense of this by thinking about other places, right? So one of the ways I framed the book at the beginning is to say there are 6 huge nation states today that take up 40% of the world's landmass. Right? Russia, China, the United States, Canada, Australia, and Brazil. 5 of those 6 are powerfully shaped by what Alfred Crosby called ecological imperialism. In other words, there was a group of settlers that had immunities to diseases that the local people didn't have, that brought with them livestock, et cetera, that had no predators in the environments they were moving into. China, that story isn't terribly important. By definition, that's going to make the Chinese story different. Doesn't mean it's non-comparable, but it's different, and it has to be thought about in other ways. The last thing I'll say, since I know I don't have much time, is that through a series of just kind of odd accidents, I've wound up in charge of a small history museum on the University of Chicago campus in Hong Kong, where we do a series, we have both a permanent collection, a series of rotating exhibits, and that's forced me to think about the global in a whole bunch of different ways. You know, we've got an exhibit up now about the history of the Hong Kong tramways, which you might think is a very local story. Turns out to be tied up with mainland politics at various moments, in strikes and boycotts that were connected to Chinese politics. It's tied up with global flows of technology and capital. It's interesting in comparative terms. Why are the Hong Kong tramways still a major form of transportation when the equivalent systems have been dismantled in almost every other major city in the world? So even something, or the next project we have is one that makes me think of, it's the kind of project Tim, I think, would do if it were in a different century. It's the story of a Polish Jew who winds up in Russia as a small child in 1917, lives through the revolution. His family then moves to Harbin, where he mostly grows up. After growing up in Harbin, he moves to Hong Kong in the mid-30s, lives most of his life there, ends up in Sydney, has a whole bunch of really interesting connections to fundamental institutions, both in Hong Kong and abroad. So that's a very different kind of global history, global in a different way. And I'm committed to pursuing all of them, which is why I don't get things done very fast.
Thank you so much, Professor Pomeranz. And actually, we can continue for a little bit after 10:30. So actually, Professor Pomeranz is talking about theory, emphasize theory. And I think also emphasize choice. I think everything is about choice. Like global history is about what theory we are doing global history, what theories you are choosing, and also what categories you are choosing. Because yesterday I posted our event in a group, a scholarly group, and the people were talking about how to understand, because I also posted Professor HIlde the Weedt article on Song Empire. So people were talking about should we use empire or should we use nation state or tianxia, different categories. And so theories are also about choices, and also Professor Pomeranz is also talking about global flow of ideas and knowledge and understanding, and also interaction between local and the global. So Professor HIlde the Weedt, your turn.
All right. I'll also briefly mention 3 projects, 2 practically finished and 1 that will take quite a while. So the first is actually very small scale and came out of a roundtable at a conference organized at HIlde by Professor Hansen. A short paper on fluid boundaries practicing middle period history, where the argument is basically turning an earlier argument about the non-comparability of medieval histories on its head, essentially making the point that fluidity is a reason to do comparison rather than the opposite, that you have to have a fixed or operable idea to do structural comparison. The idea here is that we face similar problems in regional histories, and that actually should be an invitation for us to collaborate. It plays very briefly at the end with 2 ideas that are perhaps relevant to at least some global history. And there I'm actually referring to my colleague here, Nicolas Standaert, who has done work to incorporate the philosophy of in-betweenness and the in-between to think about cross-cultural encounter in global history. So very briefly, in-betweenness is about, you could say, an ontological state, the fact that you're no longer a representative of whatever background, social, cultural, you come from, but that you're moving in the process of engaging and traveling. And the in-between is the space-time, the space, as well as a time within which that encounter happens. That is also sui generis, that is not like other spaces and temporalities associated with societies in isolation. So briefly mention that because I think that might be worth following up on. The second point I want to make is perhaps also worth making, and that is that you don't necessarily have to change the way you work to do global history. I finished a manuscript that's The Arts of Governance, the global history of medieval Sinitic literature, the global history of Sinitic literature from medieval times to the present. And essentially, I would say I worked the same way I worked when I wrote an intellectual history of the Chinese civil service examinations. I do close reading. I contextualize text and images in their social, political, and cultural background environments. But instead of limiting that framework to perhaps Chinese textual traditions, those boundaries move beyond time and space. And I would invite, actually, because it seems to me that this is an area that perhaps hasn't done as well, particularly for the pre-18th century period, the area of political thought and governance, that people also look at this as certainly a very possible way of doing better history. Like Tim, I don't think you have to do global, but it's certainly a perspective that can enrich our understanding of the sources we work with also. The last project is large scale, collaborative, and does entail quite, how would I put it, an assemblage of theoretical and methodological approaches. This is a project in the longue durée, 11th through 19th century, on the social and regional history of infrastructures, mainly roads, city walls, and bridges. And there we engage with historical anthropology, with science and technology studies, environmental humanities. And perhaps a very important reason why we do this is that it allows us to conceptualize infrastructures in ways that perhaps are not common in survey histories. I'm thinking mainly world histories, but also Chinese histories. That is, we think of them as material expressions of social relations and shapers of social relations. That's quite different from conceptualizing infrastructures as means for states or central governments to centralize resources or to exercise control, or perhaps in modern times to think about technologies, infrastructural technologies, as ways to shape the routines and thoughts of citizens. So thinking about that way also entails that you have to redesign your methodology. We've spent quite a bit of time also on developing a more sound empirical footing for this sort of work. We're developing an event-based way of reading our sources, which is very important in that a lot of work already at the very early beginning of the 20th century, Li Ji, actually an archaeologist, did do a study of city walls to think about the formation of the Chinese people. But these were highly abstracted sources that they worked with, say, 古今图书地城 overviews. But if we go back even to local gazetteers to or to systematically read through not only construction, but also destruction, things that don't work out, the failure of plans to materialize and so forth, we can really rewrite that history from the bottom up in ways that engages regions, local levels, but also different social groups. So just wanted to mention that briefly, lots of work to do, but this is one that we also hope to expand. There is already a comparative component. We're working with medieval Italian historians who are also interested in looking at the history of infrastructures, but it is something that we hope to continue in the future.
Thank you very much, and fascinating too. So you mentioned like comparison too, and also in-betweenness. I think global history is about in-betweenness and also conceptualizing, and also about temporality and boundaries moving beyond space and time. And so, and also you mentioned about methodologies. We can go back to previous methodologies. We can also redesign our methodologies. So yeah, so maybe Duara, you go, Professor Duara, you go first.
Yeah, so what are the things just as global studies seems to have replaced world history, which were, parallel histories of civilizations and empires and so on. I think global history is increasingly becoming entangled or if not replaced by what some people call planetary history, and one that sort of considers the impact of human activities on the ecospheres, right? And in particular, I work on water and the hydrosphere, but you have to learn a lot of science for this. If you don't already have it, the hydrosphere, the atmosphere, the biosphere, the lithosphere, and all of these. And also, the trend with human and non-human sort of activities now become important, particularly because I think underlying all this sort of move in that direction is the Anthropocene. Now, what I have been doing is working with a group that has been doing a lot on the hydrosphere. In fact, I am going to publish a volume, an edited volume, that is tentatively called Histories and Lives in the Hydrosphere, so to sort of indicate how it's not, I mean, we take land terrestriality as the background of all kinds of historical and social activities. But in fact, there is so much, water is so much everywhere, whether it's whether it's sweat, we have somebody working on humidity and sweat, and we have, or whether it is ice or whether it is mud, and so on. So we have people working on the monsoon. Monsoon Asia is the broad space of the volume that we're talking about. We're looking at typhoons, cyclones, the ways in which the seas have become material to humans, not just surface sailing or something or fishing, but and basically we are looking at how these natural forces have impacted and been managed quite differently at different times and in different spaces, and so from this you get a whole series of questions about adaptations, resiliences, exploitation. There's a lot on dams that also get involved. So that's the kind of thing I'm doing nowadays. It's quite a movement away. Okay, I think.
Okay, I will focus on the same direction that I'm going. It's a global and local interaction. And when I work on Zhenjiang, before I work on Zhenjiang, I actually wanted to work on the mid-sized cities in the lower Yangtze region. So I actually accumulated quite a good amount of materials about the cities and mid-sized cities, of course, and including Shanghai and Nanjing, so that I am going to focus on that right now, because I do see that the significance of focusing on the global and local interaction. And since I've already accumulated those materials and I want to take advantage of them. And besides, I think that as the panelists here have all mentioned, that global and local interaction is still part of the research we need to pursue. So that is going to be my next research project.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. And so next, Taisu, your turn.
Great. So I have maybe 6 or 7 projects going on at the same time, which is, I think, largely a sign of my inability to say no to certain kinds of things, and it's kind of a personal feeling. Some of them are related to global and comparative themes, and I'll just quickly talk about those. The main one is obviously I'm currently writing a 3rd book on how to understand China's relative economic decline in the 18th and 19th centuries and connecting that to its economic reemergence in the 20th century. And the argument kind of is that once you connect the decline to the reemergence, the re-rise, you begin to see the need, at least somewhat of a kind of a capital-centric account. And once you see the need for a capital-centric account, then the question becomes, what made capital accumulation in Chinese history uniquely difficult prior to, say, 1920, and what made it speed up considerably after that? And so then that gets into comparative histories of law and institutions, and also state building, which eventually, to me, turns out, because at some point you have to explain what created the legal differences or the differences in state capacity. It turns then on questions of cultural and political ideology. So it's kind of like an attempt to link culture ideology to institutions, to economic outcomes, but doing so in this kind of like longue durée, pan 18th, 19th, 20th century Eurasian context, where you're not just comparing China with Western Europe, but you're also comparing China with, say, Japan and Russia and the Ottomans. So it's a very kind of big, expansive book. It's the kind of book that, frankly, no one ever feels confident enough to write. You begin to feel a bit more comfortable writing about it after tenure, but even then, it's done with a great amount of trepidation. So that project is slowly ongoing. It's actually currently a bit of in a bit of a kind of like a holding pattern while I get rid of a number of article projects that I've committed to on the legal theory side of things. And of those, some are purely legal jurisprudential questions about property law and private law, or about the nature of legal coherence. But there are, I think, 3 comparative projects that are kind of worth mentioning. One is this comparative analysis that's theoretically driven, but also kind of like uses the U.S. and China as case studies on how modern governmental regimes produce information, and what are the possible legal institutions that might keep governmental manipulation of information in check. Now, there, of course, the use of comparisons is actually in somewhat of the opposite direction. In my historical work, because in the historical work, the goal is often to explain why countries differed and went on different paths. In this kind of comparative project for the kind of like modern legal theory side of things, the goal actually is to show that countries as different as the U.S. and China, which are usually thought to be on completely polar opposite ends of the modern political spectrum. One is a relatively capitalist, at least in some relative ways, kind of a small state liberal constitutional regime, in which the state does not have a ton of power vis-a-vis local populations and so on and so forth. Whereas, in contrast with this authoritarian, increasingly authoritarian, autocratic, but also like incredibly statist regime that you see emerging in China, despite that incredible difference in political regime type and culture, there are enormous commonalities between the way that these regimes treat the collection and production of state-sanctioned information. And drawing out those commonalities at basically polar opposite ends of the political spectrum is in its own way kind of like a theoretically interesting exercise that is quite different from the usual comparative fare. This also captures the underlying, I guess, like theoretical animus of 2 different projects, both of which focus on the development of the legal profession in the Chinese and U.S. contexts. He's arguing that in both contexts, Chinese lawyers and American lawyers certainly have a lot more in common than they would be comfortable acknowledging, and that a lot of nationalist constructions of political narratives about national uniqueness, of legal Orientalism, and like the uniquely kind of like national character of the American legal profession vis-a-vis the China, and so on and so forth, are all kind of fake, in the sense that there's a lot more basic kind of like self-interested rationality underlying the way the legal profession functions in both countries, and they tend to have similar jurisprudential tendencies over time. And then there's a third project, which is on Xi Jinping legal thought. That also has a certain kind of comparative element, because it's about the way that autocratic regimes claiming civilizational uniqueness have a certain kind of relationship with law. And there, the comparison is between China, Turkey, Russia, possibly like India under Modi, and also to some of the rhetoric that like right-wing Republicans have been making about Western civilization in the U.S. context, and perhaps even in like conservatives and like moderate politicians that made claims about like legal civilization and the European context as well. So it's kind of like again one of these like large-scale comparisons of the connection between claims about being a civilization and then claims about having a certain kind of legal system. So that's what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Taisu. And he's also talking about like economy and politics, and also comparison, and also returning to Professor Duara. He's talking about human and non-human. Global history is about human and non-human. So it reminds me of your article, Ocean as the Paradigm of History. So I like it very much.
If I may just add something that Taisu reminded me of, which is that I also have a project that I've been doing for a while on the Belt and Road initiative. and it's getting combined with one that is a larger project being done across Europe and America on the new civilizationism, new civilizational discourses with the rise of authoritarianism all over the world. And my goal is very much to see how the Chinese projects abroad, not only Belt and Road, but others, do involve very much a practical implementation of this new civilizationism. So that's partly also what I'm doing.
Yes.
Just very quickly, one thing I forgot to say, which is we've talked a lot about theory and we've talked a lot about the importance of being empirically rigorous. And our tendency has been to associate the empirically rigorous part of the story with making sure we get details about China right, which of course we should, as we should for other parts of the world. But when we've talked about theory, I think we've often left it implicit that theory came from outside China. And I think one of the continuing tasks we have is to generate theory from Chinese experiences. Not that that's better, but that it's an essential addition to current theoretical landscape, which is mostly built out of theorizing the experience of a kind of stylized West. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. It's very encouraging. And Professor HIlde de Weedt?
I'll also keep it short, as I realize we've gone over. But I'll follow up on the point that Ken Pomeranz just made. I agree. I would say, however, that it's paying attention to the institutional environment, that is making sure that people working on non-European or non-American parts of the world can equally contribute in history departments to these sorts of conversations is also really critical. I've certainly felt that in my own career that I was able to do certain sorts of work in certain conditions, but I wasn't always able to do global history in an area studies sort of an environment. And that is also something we need to think about because it will shape not only our futures, perhaps, but certainly the futures of those in more junior positions.
Thank you so much. And actually, in the past few days, I posted the articles from all the panelists on our WeChat public accounts. And so those articles were well welcomed by all the different historians and other scholars. So Professor Zhang, you have more to add?
No, I don't have anything to add.
Oh, okay. So, and also many thanks to all the colleagues who help us live stream the event, including the colleagues from Institute for Advanced Humanistic Studies at Peking University, the Bilibili official account, the WeChat live stream account, 微信视频号, and also the colleagues from 三年书店, SDX joint book company, 三年书店, and also from 中华 book company, 中华书局, and also from 中信大方, CITIC site, 跳岛 FM, 跳岛 FM, and talking literature, and also from political science review, and also many thanks to all the audience, and many thanks to all the speakers, and we hope we can have more conversations in the future. And also so thank you so much, and we will end our meeting today, and also look forward to future discussions. Yeah. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.